Okay, everyone, so what we're going to do is we're going to continue with our still life self-portraits. At this point, right, we're on day 2, which is what we're about to start, so you should have a good mapping of your drawing. Again, today you're going to need your kneaded eraser. You're going to want a hard eraser. You will absolutely be needing your vine charcoal. Mine is in teeny, teeny, tiny pieces. All right? And some of us might make it to compressed charcoal, okay? That happens towards the end of our project. I want to say the last 2 hours or so of a 7-hour project, okay? So be really clear if you're using your vine or if you are using your compressed charcoal, all right? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on kind of bringing one object from where it started in form to kind of completion or towards completion, or where you should be completed today, as well as showing you a little bit of how to work with patterns and folds that happen with fabric. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift into a time lapse, and I'm going to let you watch me draw without listening to me, because at this point, really the rule of the game is finish the drawing. But that's not the best advice in the world. You need to do more than that, right? So what we're going to do is kind of set up, make sure that there's nothing that we missed. Like, I can see that I really ignored some of the cards that the snail is laying on. So I'm gonna go ahead and draw some of those kind of in place. Just quickly, just mapping, laying in some shapes. It's gonna be a lot of eraser. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on finishing this area for you to see, okay? We're going to kind of zoom in, because the thing that you need to know when you're drawing is that you need to work your whole drawing up, for starters, as one collective piece. You don't just finish object A and move on to B, C, D, E, right? You need to build the whole drawing up. Is that you want to work from your background to your foreground, okay? This way you're not having to erase objects or draw around shapes. So what I'm going to start by doing is working on my furthest back space, which is this negative space behind my snail and my shark jar. So I'm going to start by really pressing my charcoal in there, okay? And then I'm going to press up alongside the edge of the jar. Now I'm going to make sure I got a good straight line going. And I'm going to start kind of blending out a little bit, because this background I can kind of work up slowly and in steps, whereas this one right here really needs to kind of come together as one. And then, because my jar is see-through, right, it's clear, it's transparent, I'm going to start drawing in the space around the wet specimen, okay, around the shark. So if you've got a clear vase, a clear mug, a clear snow globe, anything transparent where you see background through it, that background counts, okay? Now my fabric comes up a little bit over here. So I'm going to take my eraser and I'm going to do some smudging, some erasing is what we're going to call it. Smudging is the technical term, obviously. I'm going to erase up, because again, this is something that I didn't super measure accurately apparently, and we have a lot of that where we've started our mapping but we're not quite as accurate as we need to be. I'm going to scooch so you can see what I'm working on. What I've done is I've erased that line and I'm raising it about an inch. And it's because the fabric kind of goes up to this weird peak and comes back in space, because it's then setting on its objects. All right. So again, back to shark, right? I'm going to focus on how he fits in here, which was really general. And I can still see my lines, right? But I don't want them to be that heavy outlined when I'm working on this background space, because I'm gonna make sure everything's nice and realistic and established. So this is why I say, like, sometimes we don't want to go for those sweet frosting details when we don't have the drawing fully established. Okay? And I also can note that this comes out in space. I'm going to erase back in. Also, everywhere I set my hand is going to erase a little bit, so we never need to be too precious. So, continuing again, onto the shark. Now, this background space is a little bit darker. I'm going to actually maybe work reductively on this whole shape. Might be easier than trying to work additively. Now, you're going to discover that a couple of times when you're working on this, okay? Is that there's going to be points where it's going to be easier to work additively or reductively. You need to kind of make a decision about it. So I'm going to lay in my shapes. This weird little fin, which is right at the edge of the jar. I'm going to just mark in for myself. A glass top of the jar has a couple of different ellipses. And again, wanting to work background to foreground, I'm going to make some decisions. To kind of build my objects. Now remember, we said that the darkest part of a shape isn't right on the edge on a cylinder, it's just away from it. So we're going to give it some of that high reflection thickness that glass has by leaving a little peep of white. See what I did there? And now I'm going to continue filling in my background. Awesome. All right, so now my shark is about yay wide, and it's got a little indented tummy. And then its fins come up. And they're inside of a jar. So again, if you're drawing something that is transparent, this is pertinent to you because I'm drawing in my background shapes still. They are the most important part. Background. And my background's dark, so my shapes in it are dark. Okay? Mm-hmm. Its nose comes all the way up. This is a weird, very distorted shape. So what's happening is I'm a little, like, even uncomfortable with how abstract it is. And I'm having to fight drawing what I know, which is how sharks are shaped. Because everything is kind of super bendy and not realistic, even though this is kind of as realistic as you can get, considering it's a shark in a jar. So it just goes to show you that you need to be constantly working on that autocorrect, okay? Gonna do some of those circles in that glass jar top. And then we're gonna kind of get that tummy in there. Okay. I'm going to do a little bit of shading. And then I'm going to make some marks to let us know that this is glass, which are that I'm going to put in some really bright highlights that I see on the jar, and they come over the sharks. You see how important that is? But I'm erasing over him, okay? But again, don't need to start, frosting before the cake is baked here, so to speak. So that's about as dimensional as I want to get for form. I want to get complete, but only as complete as I can get using my vine charcoal, all right? We don't want to bring in our compressed yet because I don't want to commit to anything that I can't completely erase if need be. Again, I'm going to just kind of like erase some of the squigglies in here. Make some little texture marks where he's pressed against the glass. Okay? And then we're going to keep building. Now, behind the snail is the cork jar, right? And there's a weird cut in it. And it's cork. So when we're talking about things that are organic, right, we're talking about something that exists, one, on fabric, so it's got weight, and it's casting a shadow. And then you're just going to kind of play with making different marks to get what you need cork to look like. I'm making kind of weird stippling scribbles. If you've got a crystal or a plant, you're going to want to experiment. You're not just going to want to draw on the side of your paper. You're going to want to make hatch marks. You're going to want to stipple. You're going to want to try different things and just kind of like build texture and mark making. And I'm bringing it right up to the snail and right over its shell, okay? Because otherwise there's going to be a halo of a pattern effect. So if you are drawing something that's patterned, bring it a little bit into the shape that's in front of it, okay? It would be like drawing my hands, my fingers behind my top hand, if I left little gaps or little windows so that they weren't kind of completely over, right? So anything that's patterned comes over in space. And over the edges. And I'm just gonna putz with that a little bit. So that's done. Gesundheit. Yeah. I'm not gonna forget some of my polka dots and my fabric over here. Okay. Now, again, background to foreground language. So I've worked on my furthest back in space, what's backwards in the jar, where the shark itself is, and then in addition, right? Now the snail is in front of that. There's a little bit of fabric between them. Not a lot of fabric, but a little bit of fabric. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that if there are any polka dots, because my pattern is fabric, my fabric is patterned, heebie-jeebies, I'm going to go ahead and draw those in as well. Now when I'm doing that, I also want to make sure that my folds come first, okay? That they're where they need to be before my pattern is there. All right, so I do want you to make sure of that. If you've got a floral pattern or a sports pattern or something patterned on your fabric, stripes, make sure that they are following the fold, okay? So for example, there's kind of two lines here that my fold is following, and you can see that my dots get a little distorted because they're existing with that distortion. Now I'm not going to count your pattern and be like, oh, it needs to be exactly 13 circles. No, but I am going to look to see that it follows the folds, okay? And it becomes illegible. That's really hard for us when we're drawing something like polka dots or stripes or a logo that we recognize, right? Is actually letting it be illegible. It's really frustrating. So, now that I have made my texture come over and into my snail, and I've made sure my fabric is rendered in between in this space here, right? I'm gonna continue my route forward, right? Forward towards us, and start approaching the snail. Now, this is a little bit complicated because yes, the cards are behind the snail. Technically, I should draw that first. I'll do that after I start doing a time lapse, but for the purposes of right now, you're gonna watch me draw the snail, okay? So, my snail again started as the basic shapes of triangle and circle, and then I elaborated and turned it into snail shell. So I'm going through and I'm making little adjustments because my fabric could change. So if you kept your drawing up for this time, your fabric could change in the time that it takes to come back and draw again. That's something that'll happen when we're working in class all the time, so don't worry about it. Real casualty of art here, okay? So I'm gonna keep working kind of background to foreground, do a little bit of a hint of the cards, and then I'm gonna start finding what makes my snail, right, this character, different from anything else. And it's like finding the shapes that are within it, that's shading him out. That's going to mean probably having to erase some of his eyes back out. What I'm noticing is that he's got 3. 1 lines up with his shell, and then 2 go forward. 4 go forward. He's got 4 eyes. This is weird. Whatever. It's what makes him special, right? So he's got 1 that lines up with his shell, right there. And 1 eye that goes back in space a little bit over the cork. And if that eye's going over the cork, then what I'm learning is that this one's also taller. Now I'm going to do a little bit of outlining just for my own sanity here. We're going to try and make it a little bit dynamic. Because what's happening is he's kind of bulbous. So there are 2 of his eyes. He's got a little bit of shading. And a little bit of shading. A little dark in color. But not as dark as, right, the rest of it. And then he's got another eye on a stalk that's right kind of in front. Lots of careful looking, a lot of measuring when I'm doing this. Doing a little comparative measuring between the 2 eye stalks. And then I'm going to erase out again this next one. And kind of shimmy it back into space. Making little shading marks as I go. Now I'm gonna draw in his shell a little bit. And remember I pulled that pattern fabric forward, right? So I'm gonna have to erase some of that pattern. But now it's completely behind, which is really great. It creates believable depth forward. That's what we want. It's always about kind of faking it, faking depth, which, you know, sounds more melodramatic than it is when it's artwork. I'm going to put in a little bit of a shadow back here because that's where my cards are. Now his shell has a lot of stripes and striations. So I'm going to use the tip of my charcoal in a way that I don't normally use it. I'm going to draw some of those patterned stripey boys on here. Making sure again that my stripes go, my pattern goes over the whole surface. I'm just going to keep moving. And then because he's super shiny, also this gets a little bit tighter. Super shiny. He's got these little highlights on his shell. The best way to make those stand out are to make him a little bit darker. So I've already got to go a little bit darker than I planned. Gonna bring that texture back. We talked a little bit in my comments. You'll see that I wrote things like it's a back and forth, it's a dance. There's gonna be times when you put in detail and times when you erase detail. This was one of those moments. I had to erase the detail that I had just put in, all right? And you can find it frustrating and be like, oh, well, you know, but I spent time doing that. But, you know, it's time that is moving forward always. So even erasing is still moving your drawing forward, kind of towards a more completed state. Because now I'm able to actually put in those highlights where they need to be. And that's more important for my overall contrast relationship. Okay. So that's what you're gonna do moving forward. That's just to give you a really quick example of building up from shape to form with these two objects, as well as showing spatial relationships, okay? Background to foreground. Furthest back, even through transparent objects, to foreground, okay? Now I'm going to turn this off and I'm going to time-lapse film the rest of myself drawing, and you'll be able to watch them back to back.